The stars looked the same as they always did through the viewing window of the small transport ship. Jake Morrison stood there watching them while drinking his morning coffee. He was a freight captain and nothing more. His job was simple: move cargo from one planet to another and try not to get into trouble. For 3 years he had been doing exactly that. His ship was called the Frontier Runner, and it was old but reliable. The crew was small, just 4 people including himself. Lisa Grant was the medical officer, and she spent most of her time reading research papers. Greg Palmer handled tactics and security, even though they rarely needed either. Amy Rodriguez kept the engines running and complained about the lack of spare parts. They were a good team, and Jake liked it that way. Everything changed when the message came through. It was marked urgent and carried the seal of the Galactic Council. Jake had never received a message from the Council before. Most humans had not. Earth had only joined the galactic community 50 years ago, and they were still considered newcomers by the older alien races. The message was short and direct. It ordered Jake to bring his ship and crew to the Council station immediately. No explanation was given and no refusal was accepted. Jake called his crew to the bridge and showed them the message. Lisa frowned while reading it. Greg crossed his arms and said nothing. Amy looked worried. They all knew that when the Council summoned someone, it was never for a good reason. The journey took 3 weeks through slipspace. During that time, Jake tried to figure out what the Council wanted with them. They had not broken any laws or entered restricted space. Their cargo manifest was clean and their ship registration was current. Nothing made sense. When they finally arrived at the Council station, Jake felt his stomach tighten with nervousness. The station was massive and beautiful. It hung in space like a crystal palace with walls that were transparent. Inside those walls were aliens from dozens of different species. Some walked on 2 legs like humans. Others floated or crawled or moved in ways that hurt to watch. Jake and his crew were escorted through long hallways by guards who did not speak. Eventually, they reached a conference chamber where the Council members waited. The lead counselor was a Veltharan named Sarah. Her skin was translucent and glowed with soft blue light. She looked at Jake with eyes that had no pupils and spoke in a voice like wind chimes. She asked if he understood why he had been summoned. Jake said no. He did not understand at all. Sarah gestured and a hologram appeared in the center of the room. It showed a weapon unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The weapon was a blade, but it seemed alive. Energy moved along its surface and strange symbols covered the handle. Sarah explained that this was the Starbreaker blade. For 10,000 years it had protected the Council worlds from outside threats. It was the reason the galaxy had known peace for so long. Jake listened carefully and wondered what this had to do with him. Then Sarah told him the bad news. 3 months ago the blade had stopped working. It went dormant and would not respond to anyone. Without the blade, the Council was vulnerable to their greatest enemy, the Void Swarm. Jake had heard stories about the swarm. Entire worlds had gone silent after encountering it. Fleets had vanished without a trace. The hologram changed to show a mass of darkness that seemed to eat light itself. Inside the darkness were shapes that moved with terrible purpose. Jake felt cold just looking at it. Sarah said that the swarm would break through the Council's defenses within 6 months. Trillions of lives would be lost. Unless the blade could be awakened again. That was when Sarah dropped the real shock. She said that ancient records suggested humans had created the Starbreaker blade. Jake almost laughed. Humans were barely able to travel between stars, and the Council was saying they had made a weapon that protected the entire galaxy. It seemed impossible, but Sarah insisted the records were clear. Human blood was the key to awakening the blade. Jake looked back at his crew. Lisa appeared thoughtful while Greg remained expressionless. Amy looked scared, which Jake felt was the most honest reaction. He asked what would happen if they refused to help. Sarah said the Council would find other humans to try. But time was running out and Jake's ship had been the closest when they made this discovery. It might be fate or it might be bad luck. Either way, the Council was asking for help. Jake asked where the blade was located. Sarah said it was on the Council homeworld of Thalsora in a secure facility. Jake said he would go see it, but he was not making any promises. If this was as dangerous as Sarah claimed, then he needed to understand the risks first. Sarah agreed and said his ship would be escorted to Thalsora immediately. Then she added something that made Jake's blood run cold. She said 17 warriors had tried to awaken the blade since it went dormant. All 17 had died. Their bodies could not handle the energy the blade released. The only difference was that none of them had been human. Sarah believed that human biology would make the process survivable, but she could not guarantee it. If Jake died, they would simply try with another human. And another, until the blade awakened or the void swarm consumed everything. The meeting ended and Jake walked back to his ship in silence. His crew followed without speaking. They all knew what had just happened. They had been given an impossible choice. Risk death trying to wake an ancient weapon or let the galaxy fall to an enemy that could not be stopped. When they reached the docking bay, Lisa grabbed Jake's arm. She said they needed to talk about this seriously. She was a doctor and she had taken an oath to preserve life. Asking Jake to touch something that had killed 17 people was asking him to commit suicide. Jake understood her concern, but he also understood what would happen if they did nothing. The void swarm would not stop with the Council worlds. Eventually it would reach human space. It would reach Earth. How many people would die then? Greg said he was with Jake no matter what. Someone needed to watch the captain's back and he did not trust the Council to do it properly. Amy agreed to come along because someone had to keep the ship running. Lisa was the last to decide. She clearly did not want to risk Jake's life, but she also knew he was right about the stakes. Finally, she sighed and said someone had to keep him alive long enough to touch the blade. If he died, she promised she would kill him. Despite everything, Jake smiled. They boarded the Frontier Runner together and prepared for departure. A Council warship arrived to escort them, and Jake stood on the bridge watching the stars. Somewhere out there, the void swarm was moving closer. Somewhere on a distant world, an ancient blade waited. Jake Morrison was about to become part of something much larger than hauling cargo. He just hoped he would survive it. Thelsora was not like any planet Jake had ever seen. It was not a sphere but a giant ring that wrapped around a dying star. Millions of years of construction had turned it into a paradise with cities that sparkled like diamonds. Gardens floated in zero gravity connected by bridges made of solid light. It was beautiful and strange and completely beyond anything humans had built. The Frontier Runner docked at a facility that stuck out from the ring like a needle. Council guards met them at the airlock, and these guards were heavily armed. They represented different alien species and all of them looked serious. Jake and his crew were escorted through multiple security checkpoints. Machines scanned everything about them from their DNA to what they were thinking. Whatever the machines found must have been acceptable because the guards let them pass. Their guide was a Corthian, whose name Jake could not pronounce. The alien looked like he was made of stone and spoke with a voice that rumbled like thunder. He led them deeper into the facility through corridors that were different from the beautiful parts above. These walls were reinforced with strange metals and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Lisa whispered that the symbols were protective wards designed to contain massive energy. Whatever was down here, the Council really did not want it escaping. They descended for what felt like hours through elevators and spiral ramps that went deep into the ring structure. Finally, they reached a massive door that looked like it was made from frozen starlight. A dozen guards stood watch, but their weapons were pointed at the door itself, rather than at any external threat. The Corthian explained that the blade was kept beyond this door. He said Jake needed to understand the risk before proceeding. The weapon was not dormant because it was inactive. It was dormant because it was waiting. When Jake approached it, the blade would react. That reaction had proven fatal to everyone who had tried. Greg asked how the others had died. The Corthian's stony features showed what might have been respect for the question. He said each death was different, but all shared certain things. The blade released energy directly into their bodies. For some, it was instant and their organs simply stopped working. For others, it took longer and their genetic structure broke down at the molecular level. None of them survived more than 17 seconds of contact. The longest survival time belonged to a warrior named Commander Thrace, who was the strongest fighter they had ever trained. Her willpower kept her alive for 17 seconds before her heart gave out. Amy asked if there was a way to regulate the blade's energy output before Jake touched it. The Corthian shook his head and said they had tried everything. The blade existed partially outside normal space and time. Its energy could not be measured by regular methods. They knew it released power and they knew that power was lethal, but they did not know why. Greg pointed out that if humans created the blade, then either their ancestors were crazy or there was something about human biology that made this survivable. The Corthian agreed that this was their belief, but it was only a belief until someone proved it. Lisa stepped forward and said she needed time to examine Jake before they did anything. She wanted a full genetic workup and neurological scan. If there was something about his biology that would help him survive, she needed to identify it. The Corthian said medical facilities had been prepared for exactly that purpose. She would have 4 hours. Lisa protested that 4 hours was not enough time for a proper examination. The Corthian's expression became grave, and he said the Void Swarm had breached the outer defensive perimeter. They were moving faster than anyone had anticipated. In 6 days they would reach populated systems. The Council no longer had the luxury of extensive preparation. 4 hours was all they could spare. Lisa's jaw clenched, but she nodded. They could not waste any more time arguing. The medical bay they were taken to was incredible. It had equipment from dozens of different civilizations, and each piece was designed to analyze alien biology. Lisa immediately began setting up her instruments. She told Jake to strip to the waist and lie down on the examination table. This was going to require every scanning technology she had access to. Greg and Amy were sent to an observation room, but Jake could see them through the transparent wall, watching with obvious concern. The scans were invasive and exhausting. Lisa worked in focused silence, only occasionally muttering to herself as data streamed across her displays. Jake watched the readouts and saw his own genetic code mapped in 3 dimensions. His neural pathways were traced like rivers of light. After 2 hours, Lisa made a sound of surprise. She said that according to the scans, Jake was entirely human, but his DNA had markers she had never seen before. There were inactive sequences that did not match anything in the human genome database. Jake asked what that meant. Lisa explained that either he was a mutation, or these sequences were so old they had been bred out of the general population. If she had to guess, she would say these were remnant genes from early human development. From before humans left Earth and before they encountered the Council. Jake asked if that made him some kind of throwback. Lisa said it was more like he was an echo of what humans used to be. If the blade really was created by ancient humans, then these genetic markers might be what it was looking for. Greg asked through the intercom if the markers would help Jake survive. Lisa admitted she did not know. The genes were inactive and dormant, just like the blade, but if they activated when Jake touched the weapon, he might have a chance. She emphasized the word might because there were no guarantees. Jake said that was better than nothing. Lisa disagreed and said it was not much better. She ran another scan focused on his brain patterns. She found that Jake had higher than normal activity in regions associated with willpower and determination. The Council had mentioned that the blade responded to intent and not just biology. Maybe that was the other half of the equation. Jake joked that he needed ancient genes and a stubborn personality. Lisa was not amused and said he needed to take this seriously. If the blade worked, it was going to hurt a lot. There was no guarantee he would survive even if his genes were compatible. The 4 hours passed too quickly. Lisa compiled her findings and shared them with the Council's medical experts. She ran simulation after simulation, but every scenario ended the same way with inconclusive results. There was no way to know if Jake would survive until he actually touched the blade. When the Corthian returned, his expression was grave. He said it was time. They walked back to the massive door in silence. The guards made it clear that only Jake could enter the chamber beyond. Jake looked at his crew and told them that if something went wrong, they should get back to human space. They should tell Earth what happened here and that the galaxy needed them. Amy insisted nothing would go wrong, but her voice cracked when she said it. Greg simply told Jake to give them hell. Lisa pulled him into a tight hug and told him not to die. Jake nodded and stepped through the door. It closed behind him with a sound like thunder. The chamber beyond was vast and empty. It was lit by pale blue light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In the center of the room, hovering at chest height, was the Starbreaker blade. It was more magnificent than any hologram could show. The weapon was about 5 feet long, and its blade looked like crystallized starlight. Energy rippled along its edge in waves. The symbols Jake had seen in the hologram spiraled around the handle in constant motion. The blade was not dormant at all. It was sleeping and waiting and dreaming of the hands that had forged it. Jake approached slowly with his heart pounding hard in his chest. With each step he could feel the blade's presence growing stronger. It was aware of him. It was watching him. It was judging him. At 10 feet away, the symbols began to glow brighter. At 5 feet, Jake could feel energy crackling across his skin. At 3 feet, his dormant genetic sequences activated and flooded his system with sensations he had no words for. At 1 foot away, Jake paused. He could see his reflection in the blade's surface, but it was distorted and changed. He looked older and scarred and exhausted. He looked like someone who had fought a war and barely survived. Jake took a deep breath and spoke to the empty chamber, and to the weapon, and to himself. He said it was time to find out what humans were really made of. Then he reached out and grasped the handle. Pain exploded through his body in ways he could not describe. It was not fire or ice or electricity. It was all of those and none of them. The sensation was so intense that Jake's mind could not process it properly. He felt his genetic code being read and analyzed and accepted. The blade was looking into him and through him. It was seeing every moment of his life and every life that had come before him. In his mind, Jake saw his ancestors. Not the recent ones, but the ancient humans who had walked under alien stars thousands of years ago. They were warriors and scientists and philosophers and explorers. They had built the blade not as a weapon of conquest but as a shield, a final defense against threats that even they had feared. The blade showed Jake why it had gone dormant. The humans who created it had vanished in a war so terrible that the galaxy had chosen to forget it ever happened. Without human hands to guide it, the blade had slept. It had waited for the day when humans would return to the stars. That day was now, and Jake screamed as the bonding process intensified. His genetic code was being rewritten, and his neural pathways were being changed to accommodate the weapon's vast intelligence. The blade was alive or something close to it, and it was merging with him at a fundamental level. The Corthian had said 17 seconds was the longest anyone had survived. Jake had already passed 20 seconds, then 30, then a full minute. The pain did not stop, but Jake refused to let go. He held on with every ounce of willpower he possessed. He was driven by the memory of the void swarm consuming worlds, and by his crew's faith in him and by the simple, stubborn humanity that defined his species. The blade responded to that determination. It recognized the quality that made humans unique among all the species in the galaxy, the ability to endure the unendurable and to survive the unsurvivable and to fight on when all reason said to quit. 2 minutes in, and the pain began to fade. The energy that had been burning through Jake's body started to flow in harmony with his own life force. His genetic code stabilized by incorporating the new sequences the blade had written. His neural pathways settled into new patterns that allowed him to sense the weapon as an extension of himself. At 3 minutes, Jake opened his eyes. He was still standing and still holding the blade, but everything had changed. He could feel the weapon's power thrumming through his veins. He could sense its connection to the fabric of space and time itself. The blade was not just a weapon. It was a key and a tool for shaping reality according to the wielder's will, and it was his now, bonded to him at a level so deep that he would never truly be separate from it again. Jake lifted the Starbreaker blade, and it responded like it had been waiting for this moment for 10,000 years. The symbols along its length blazed with light, and the weapon sang with a sound that resonated through dimensions humans could not normally perceive. The door to the chamber burst open. The Corthian rushed in, and his rocky features showed something Jake had never seen before, which was shock. He said it was impossible. Jake was alive, and the blade had awakened. Jake looked down at the weapon in his hand and then back at the Corthian. He said he guessed humans really did make this thing after all. Then his legs gave out and the world went dark. The last thing Jake felt before unconsciousness claimed him was the blade's presence in his mind. It was steady and patient and waiting for him to wake up and learn what it meant to wield the weapon that would save the stars. Jake woke to the sound of alarms. His body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled wrong. Every muscle ached and every nerve ending was hypersensitive. But beneath the pain he could feel something else, which was power. The blade's energy thrummed through his veins as a constant presence at the edge of his awareness. Lisa's voice cut through the fog and told him to take it easy. She said not to try to move yet because his body had been through hell. Jake forced his eyes open. The medical bay ceiling swam into focus, and it was too bright and too detailed all at once. Jake could see individual molecules in the metal. He could trace the energy patterns running through the facility's walls. The blade had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Jake asked how long he had been unconscious. Lisa said it had been 18 hours since he bonded with the blade. His vitals had been all over the place during that time. She told him his genetic code was completely different from what it had been before. He was still human, but he was also something more now. Jake asked about the alarms. Lisa's expression darkened, and she said it was the void swarm. They had accelerated their attack. The outer defensive line had collapsed 6 hours ago. They were moving toward the core systems faster than anyone had predicted. Jake forced himself to sit up despite Lisa's protests. His body screamed in agony, but the blade's power helped him push through it. He asked where the weapon was. Greg entered the room carrying the Starbreaker blade carefully in both hands. Even sheathed, the weapon glowed with barely contained power. He explained that they had tried to remove it from the chamber, but it would not let anyone else touch it. The blade had started throwing off energy bursts that almost killed 3 guards. Then it went inert until Greg mentioned bringing it to Jake. Jake reached out and the blade responded instantly. It flew from Greg's hands to his own. The movement was so smooth and natural that it looked choreographed. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, strength flooded back into his body. The pain receded and was replaced by a clarity of purpose that was almost frightening. Greg continued and said the council wanted to see them. They had called an emergency session. The Void Swarm was not attacking randomly anymore. They were coordinated and moving with purpose toward Thalsora itself. Jake realized what that meant. The swarm knew the blade was awake. They were coming for it. Lisa corrected him and said they were coming for Jake. The council's scientists had been studying the energy readings from his bonding. They thought the Void Swarm was drawn to the blade's power signature. By awakening it, Jake had essentially painted a target on this entire system. Amy joined them and said they needed to leave. They should take the fight somewhere else before the swarm reached Thalsora. A new voice interrupted and said it was not that simple. The Veltheran counselor Sarah materialized from the corridor. Her bioluminescent patterns pulsed with stress. She said the blade was powerful, but Jake did not yet know how to use it. Sending him into battle now would be suicide. Jake argued that it was better than waiting while the swarm came to them. Sarah agreed, which was why they had arranged for training. She said they required Greg and Amy's presence as well. Greg raised an eyebrow and asked if they wanted to train the crew. He pointed out that they were not soldiers. Sarah said that was true, but they were human. The blade had made it clear that it responded to human presence. The more humans there were, the stronger its power became. This was not something they had anticipated, but the ancient texts supported it. The blade was meant to be wielded by multiple humans and not just one. Jake felt the truth of it through his connection to the weapon. The blade was vast, and its power was designed to be distributed among many bearers. He alone could not access its full potential. He asked how much time they had. Sarah said the swarm would reach the outer edge of this system in 72 hours. They had 3 days to teach Jake to fight with a weapon that had not been used in 10,000 years. They moved to a training facility that occupied an entire section of the ring structure. The space was massive, with variable gravity and environmental controls that could simulate any battlefield condition. A dozen of the council's finest warriors waited there. Their expressions ranged from skeptical to hostile. Jake could not blame them. 17 of their comrades had died trying to wake the blade. Now a human who had barely survived the bonding was expected to save the galaxy. The lead trainer was a Primus warrior who looked like he could tear Jake apart with his bare hands. He demanded that Jake show them what he could do. Jake drew the Starbreaker blade. The instant it left its sheath, the entire facility seemed to resonate with its power. The weapon felt weightless in his hand and perfectly balanced and eager to be used. Jake told the Primus to attack him. The warrior did not hesitate. He moved with shocking speed for something his size and closed the distance in a heartbeat. His strike would have killed a normal human instantly. Jake did not think. He reacted on instinct and let the blade guide him. The weapon moved in a perfect arc. It intercepted the warrior's blow and redirected its force. Energy crackled along the blade's edge, and the Primus warrior was thrown backward. He crashed into the far wall with tremendous force. Silence filled the training hall. The warrior slowly stood with shock clear on his features. He said that should not have been possible. He was 3 times Jake's weight and 5 times his strength. Jake realized what had happened. The blade equalized combat. It did not just enhance his strength. It negated advantages based on physical power alone. Sarah urged him to test it further. She said the Void Swarm did not rely on conventional combat. They attacked the mind as well as the body. The training intensified over the next 3 days. Jake learned to channel the blade's power in ways that defied normal physics. He could cut through reinforced barriers and deflect energy blasts. He could even manipulate the fabric of space and time itself on a small scale. But the most important discovery came when Greg and Amy finally got involved. On the 2nd day of training, Greg touched the blade while Jake was holding it. The result was instant and dramatic. The weapon's power surged, and for a moment Greg's mind connected with Jake's through the blade's consciousness. They could share thoughts and coordinate actions with perfect synchronization. Jake realized this was how it was meant to work. The blade created a network and a shared consciousness among its bearers. They experimented further. When Amy joined the connection, the blade's power increased again. But it was different for each of them. Jake felt its combat applications most clearly. Greg could sense tactical implications and see battlefield patterns and strategic openings. Amy could feel the blade's connection to technology. She understood how its power could be used to enhance or disable machinery. Sarah observed that they were becoming a unit. She said this was what the ancient text said. Jake stood on an observation deck watching as the enemy appeared at the system's edge. The void swarm was even more terrifying than the holograms had shown. It was a living darkness that seemed to consume everything it touched. Worlds vanished into its mass, and ships that ventured too close simply ceased to exist. Greg stood beside him studying tactical displays. He reported that the Council fleet was moving to intercept. 300 warships were assembling, which was the largest force they had put together in centuries. They were trying to buy time for civilian evacuations. Amy looked at the data and said quietly that it would not be enough. She had been analyzing the swarm's composition and found that it was not biological or technological. It was something else entirely, something that existed partially outside normal space. Conventional weapons could hurt it, but they could not stop it. Jake decided they needed to use an unconventional weapon. He turned to Sarah, who had remained by his side since training began. He told her to get them a ship. Something fast and well-armed because they were going out there. Sarah's patterns flickered with concern, and she said Jake had only 3 days of training. The Council's warriors had trained for lifetimes. Jake understood her point, but he also knew that none of those warriors could use the blade. He was not saying he was ready for this fight. But ready or not, the swarm was here. They could either hide behind the Council fleet and watch them die, or they could try to make a difference. Sarah's patterns changed to what might have been respect. She said the Council would provide them with the Vanguard, which was their fastest assault ship. But she warned Jake that if the blade fell to the Void Swarm, and if they consumed its power, then the galaxy was lost. He carried not just a weapon, but the last hope of 1 trillion souls. An hour later, Jake found himself on the bridge of the Vanguard. Greg was at tactical, and Amy was at engineering, and Lisa was manning the medical station. The ship was sleek and deadly. It was armed with weapons that could crack planets. But as they accelerated toward the Void Swarm, Jake knew that all the firepower in the galaxy would not matter if the blade failed them. Greg announced they were approaching engagement range. The Council fleet was taking heavy casualties. The swarm was adapting to their attack patterns faster than they could adjust. Jake drew the Starbreaker blade and told Greg and Amy to link with him. His crew members placed their hands on the blade. The connection formed instantly, and suddenly Jake could see the battlefield through 3 perspectives at once. He saw tactical opportunities Greg identified. He saw structural weaknesses Amy detected. He saw physiological patterns Lisa observed in the swarm's behavior. Jake commanded them to take the ship in. It was time to test the blade in real combat. The Vanguard dove into the swarm like a bird diving into storm clouds. Up close, Jake could see that the darkness was composed of individual entities. Each one was roughly humanoid but twisted and wrong. They did not move through space normally. Instead, they slipped between dimensions and appeared and disappeared with nauseating randomness. Greg called out for weapons free, and the Vanguard's main cannons opened fire. Energy beams tore through the swarm, and for a moment it seemed to work. Dozens of entities burned away, and their forms dissolved into nothing. But for every one destroyed, 10 more appeared to take its place. Amy reported that they were phasing in from somewhere else. There was a dimensional breach somewhere in the swarm, and that was how they kept getting reinforcements. Jake felt the blade pulse in his hand, and suddenly he understood. The entities were not creatures. They were symptoms. The Void Swarm was an infection from another dimension, and what they were fighting was just the visible part. Lisa asked if the blade could seal the breach. Jake said maybe, but he needed to get close to the source. He closed his eyes and let the blade extend his senses through the swarm. There, deep in the massive darkness, he felt it. A wound in reality itself that pulsed with evil energy. Jake told Greg to plot a course straight through the swarm. He told Amy to divert all power to shields. He told Lisa to get ready for casualties because this was going to get messy. The Vanguard changed course and dove deeper into enemy territory. The swarm immediately recognized the threat. Hundreds of entities converged on their ship. They tore at the shields with claws that existed in multiple dimensions at once. Amy reported that shields were at 60%. Then 50%. They were not going to make it at this rate. Jake insisted they would make it. He reached out with the blade, and suddenly he was not just holding a weapon anymore. He was the weapon. His consciousness expanded through the Vanguard's hull. It merged with the ship's systems and became one with the vessel itself. Lisa asked what he was doing, and her voice was filled with alarm. She said his neural activity was off the charts. Jake replied that he was using the blade the way it was meant to be used. He told Greg to give him targeting control. He told Amy to sync the engines with the blade's frequency. His crew did not hesitate because they trusted him. That trust flowed through their connection to the blade and strengthened it. The Vanguard began to glow with the same energy that crackled along the blade's edge. They crashed through the swarm like a comet through clouds. Entities that touched the ship's hull simply ceased to exist. They were erased by the blade's power. But the closer they got to the dimensional breach, the stronger the resistance became. The swarm was protecting its entry point with everything it had. Greg announced the target was ahead. Distance was 1,000 kilometers and closing. Jake could see it now with his physical eyes. The breach looked like a tear in the fabric of space. It was raw and bleeding darkness. Things moved within it, vast and terrible entities so large that the humanoid forms were just fragments of their true selves. Jake realized with growing horror that the Void Swarm was not an invasion. It was a reconnaissance force. Whatever was on the other side of that breach was big enough to swallow entire galaxies. Amy said firmly that they needed to seal it now before anything else came through. The Vanguard reached the breach, and Jake raised the Starbreaker blade. Through his connection to the ship, the entire vessel became an extension of the weapon. Energy gathered along the hull and built to levels that should have torn the ship apart. But the blade held it together and channeled it and focused it into a single point of absolute destructive power. Jake warned everyone to hold on because this was going to hurt. Then he released the blade's power. The universe itself seemed to scream. Reality recoiled from the forces being unleashed. The breach began to close with its edges pulling together like a healing wound. But whatever was on the other side did not want to let go. Massive forms pressed against the closing gap and tried to force it back open. Jake felt the blade's consciousness merge fully with his own. In that moment, he understood what his ancestors had created. The Starbreaker was not just a weapon. It was a tool for repairing reality, for sealing breaches and healing damage caused by entities that existed beyond normal space and time. The ancient humans who forged it were not conquerors. They were defenders and guardians standing at the edge of their reality. They fought to keep the darkness at bay, and now 10,000 years later their descendants were taking up that duty again. Amy shouted that it was working. The breach was closing, but the effort was costing Jake everything. He could feel his body failing and his mind burning under the strain of channeling so much power. The blade was sustaining him, but even it had limits when pushed this hard. Lisa warned that his vitals were critical. He needed to stop before he killed himself. Jake gasped that he could not stop. Not yet, because they were almost there. The breach was nearly closed now. Just a thin line of darkness remained. But through their connection, Jake could feel Greg's tactical mind working. He could sense what his friend was about to do. Jake tried to tell him not to, but it was too late. Greg pressed his hand harder against the blade and flooded his own life force into it. The additional power was exactly what Jake needed. The breach snapped shut with a sound like thunder, and suddenly the Void Swarm had no more reinforcements. Without the breach feeding them, the entities began to dissolve. They lasted only minutes in normal space once cut off from their home dimension. Within an hour, the swarm was gone and reduced to harmless dust that scattered among the stars. But Greg collapsed on the bridge with blood trickling from his nose and ears. The effort had nearly killed him. Jake ordered them to get back to Thalsora immediately. It was a medical emergency. He told someone to inform the council that the breach was sealed. For now, at least. As the Vanguard limped back toward the ring world, Jake stared at the blade in his hand. They had won this battle, but he could feel the truth in his bones. The Void Swarm would return. The entities beyond the breach would find another way through. They would find another weakness to exploit. The galaxy was not saved. It was just bought some time, and Jake Morrison, who had been a simple freight captain, was now a blade wielder. He would have to figure out how to make that time count. He looked at Greg lying unconscious on the floor. He looked at Lisa working frantically to save their friend. He looked at Amy, whose hands shook as she piloted the damaged ship. They had all paid a price today. They had all sacrificed something, and Jake knew deep in his heart that Greg survived, but it took 3 days of intensive medical care. Lisa fought to repair the damage he had done to himself by forcing too much energy through the blade. When he finally opened his eyes, his first words were an apology. He said he was sorry, but they had needed the power and he knew it would hurt him. Jake sat beside his friend's bed with the Starbreaker blade resting across his knees. Since the battle, he had not been able to let it go. The weapon had become part of him, and separation caused physical pain. Jake said quietly that Greg could have died. Greg managed a weak smile and pointed out that Jake could have died too. So could everyone on Thalsora and every world beyond it. He had made a choice, and it was the same choice Jake had made when he first touched the blade. Jake insisted it should not have been that way. The blade was supposed to distribute its power among multiple bearers, but when Greg channeled his energy into it, he took all the damage himself. Something was wrong with how they were using the weapon. Greg told him to figure out what was wrong because that was what Jake was good at. Problem solving. Jake looked down at the blade and its symbols still spiraled along the handle. Now he could read them. The bonding process had given him understanding of the ancient human language his ancestors had used. The markings told a story, and Jake had spent the last 3 days learning to read it. He said finally that the blade was never meant to be used in combat. Not primarily anyway. Its main purpose was exactly what they had used it for, which was sealing dimensional breaches. His ancestors had been fighting the same enemy for maybe generations. They learned that the only way to stop it was to prevent it from entering their reality in the first place. Greg said that explained why it worked so well against the breach, but struggled in direct combat. Jake agreed and said the problem was that sealing a breach required massive amounts of energy. Energy the blade drew from its bearers. One human alone could not provide enough power without dying, but multiple humans linked together and sharing the load could sustain it. Greg pointed out that was what they did, except he nearly killed himself doing it. Jake stood and began pacing the medical bay with restless energy. He said they did it wrong. The connection needed to be permanent and not temporary. The blade wanted to bond with all of them and not just with him, but Jake had been holding it alone and keeping it to himself. That was why Greg took so much damage. He forced a temporary connection when what they needed was a permanent one. Lisa entered the room with Amy close behind. She asked if Jake was suggesting what she thought he was suggesting. Jake said that Greg and Amy and Lisa needed to bond with the blade properly the way he had done. Lisa's expression hardened and she said absolutely not. Jake had barely survived the bonding process. Greg had just spent 3 days in a coma. She was not letting anyone else risk their lives on a theory. Jake argued it was not a theory. The blade was showing him how it worked. He could feel the template for multiple bearers and the way power was supposed to flow between them. Right now he was like a circuit with only one connection. The energy had nowhere to go. But with all 4 of them bonded, the blade could function as it was designed. Amy asked quietly what would happen if he was wrong. If the bonding process killed them, Jake said bluntly that he would have murdered his best friends in the galaxy. But if he was right, they would have a chance to actually stop the Void Swarm. Not just delay them, but end them permanently. The room fell silent. Finally, Greg spoke from his bed and asked how long before the swarm came back. Jake met his eyes and said the Council's scientists estimated 2 weeks before another breach opened. The entities beyond were persistent. They had found a weak point in their dimension, and they were going to keep hammering at it until they broke through. Greg repeated the time frame and said they needed to be ready before then. Lisa started to protest that Greg was in no condition for anything. Greg interrupted and said he was fine or he would be in a few days. He agreed with Jake. They all felt how the blade worked when they touched it. One bearer was not enough. They needed to be a unit. Amy nodded slowly and said she was in. But she wanted to study the bonding process first. She wanted to understand what they were getting into. Jake had gone into this blind and they should be smarter about it. Jake agreed that was fair. He looked at Lisa and asked what she thought. The doctor's jaw clenched. Every instinct she had screamed against this. But she had seen the Void Swarm. She had felt its evil through the blade's connection. And she knew deep in her bones that Jake was right. She said to give her 2 days. 2 days to prepare medical protocols and study every aspect of Jake's transformation. If she was doing this, she was doing it as safely as possible. Over the next 2 days, the Frontier Runner's crew became the focus of intense attention. Scientists from dozens of species studied Jake's biology and mapped every change the blade had made to his genetic code. Engineers analyzed the weapon itself and tried to understand its dimensional mechanics. Philosophers debated the ethics of allowing more humans to bond with such power. Sarah visited them on the evening of the second day. She admitted the council was divided. Some believed they should attempt the bonding. Others feared that creating more blade bearers would only make them bigger targets for the Void Swarm. Amy pointed out that they were already targets. The swarm had come straight for Thalsora the moment the blade awakened. They knew what it was and what it could do. Whether there was one bearer or 4 would not change that. Sarah said perhaps that was true, but it would change the balance of power in the galaxy. 4 humans wielding the Starbreaker blade would be nearly unstoppable. Some council members feared that as much as they feared the Void Swarm. Greg said bluntly that those council members were idiots. The swarm wanted to consume everything. The humans just wanted to stop them. Those were not the same kind of threat. Sarah replied that fear was rarely logical. The council had watched humanity for 50 years. Humans were aggressive and expansionistic and frighteningly adaptable. What would happen after the swarm was defeated? What would 4 humans with godlike power choose to do then? Jake had been silent through most of the conversation, but now he spoke. He said they would go home. They would go back to hauling cargo and fixing ships and living their lives. The blade chose them because they were here and not because they wanted power. Once this was over, they would gladly give it up. Sarah asked if he was certain about that. She said power was seductive even when taken reluctantly. Jake told her to watch them. When this was over, if they did not give up the blade, she could do whatever she needed to do. Exile them or imprison them and they would not fight back. But right now the council needed them. The galaxy needed them. And they needed to be bonded properly, if they were going to have any chance of stopping what was coming. Sarah studied him for a long moment with her patterns flickering. Finally, she said the council would permit the additional bondings. But they would be watching, and if the humans became a threat, the council would act. The bonding ceremony took place in the same chamber where Jake had first touched the blade. The 4 crew members came together and faced the weapon that had changed everything. Amy asked nervously who should go first. Greg said he would. Jake had nearly died doing this alone. If something went wrong, it was better that it happened to him than to the others. Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but Greg silenced her with a look. He said he was the tactical officer, and it was his job to take point when things got dangerous. Jake held out the blade and told Greg that when he touched it, he should not fight the pain. He should not try to control what it did. He should just hold on and let it complete the bonding. Greg nodded and reached out. His fingers brushed the blade's handle and the reaction was instant. Energy flooded through him, but it was different from Jake's experience. The blade knew what it was doing this time. It knew exactly how to merge with human biology. Greg gasped and his body convulsed as his genetic code rewrote itself in real time. But Jake could feel through his connection that the blade was being careful. It was preserving Greg's essential nature while adding necessary enhancements. 60 seconds later, it was done. When Greg opened his eyes, they glowed faintly with the blade's energy. He looked at Jake and understanding flashed between them. They were connected now in a way that went beyond words. Greg said he could feel Jake's thoughts and emotions. It was like they were 2 parts of the same person. Jake confirmed that was exactly what they were. The blade made them one mind working through multiple bodies. Amy went next and her bonding was even smoother. The blade was learning and adapting with each new bearer. When she opened her eyes, Jake felt the connection expand. Now there were 3 of them linked through the weapon. Amy said she could feel the ship and the station they were on. The blade let her interface with technology directly. Jake realized the blade was enhancing what each person was already good at. For him it was combat and leadership. For Greg it was tactics and strategy. For Amy it was technology and engineering. Lisa was last. She approached with obvious fear, but she did not hesitate. When her hand touched the blade, Jake felt something different happen. The blade recognized her medical knowledge and her deep understanding of life. It bonded with her in a way that emphasized